Okay, so this is the last, you'll be happy to know this is the last design we're going to go through today. And I want to mention, because this is also a relatively rapid study design, studies that you can do relatively cheaply and rapidly. And they end up being quite common in hospitals. Actually, we don't really need this slide, right? So we saw that this is just we saw that there's a lot of text. So in cohort studies, we start with the exposure and we go to the outcome. In case control study, we start with the outcome and we go to the exposure. In cross-sectional studies, you look at the exposure and the outcome at the same time. So you have a single point in time where you collect information on your patients, and you can think about it as a snapshot. You just look at what are things looking at this particular point in time. So you measure exposure and outcome at the same time. So if you did say, let's take smoking and lung cancer. If you did a cohort study, you would start with smokers and non-smokers, you would follow them through time and see whether or not they develop lung cancer.
How many patients hospitalized with severe coronavirus but are not immunized?
For example, so if you wanted to do this, you would take immunized. So it's if you don't like the lung cancer and think, let's use a more contemporary. Immunized people, not immunized people, and you follow them and you look how many end up in the corona intensive care unit. Okay, one study design. Second study design, people in the intensive care unit with corona, people not in the intensive care unit with corona. Look how many are vaccinated. A cross-sectional study, you would look at one point in time and ask people, were you admitted to intensive care unit at any point? Yes, no. Did you get vaccinated? Yes, no. Right? So very easy, very quick, a snapshot, but the main limitation is you don't know, and you cannot easily reconstruct the timeline. You don't know whether the exposure preceded the outcome, by how much, etc., etc. And the other thing is, if you're looking at one point in time, this is more suitable for diseases that are that last for a long time. So this is prevalence, and you know the difference between prevalence and incidence, right? So prevalence is the number of cases in a population at a particular time. The incidence is new cases. So if you wanted to do, if you wanted to know, for example, how many people were diabetic in a population, doing across and the association between diabetes and smoking, you could ask, you could use a cross-sectional design to catch enough people that are diabetic. If you're interested in a disease which come and go, like an infectious disease, for example, it's less suited because at a particular point in time, the disease will come and go, and it will be harder to catch the cases if you want with that kind of design. Yes.
Her study is cross-sectional. She's going to measure how many people are going to be diagnosed, how many women are going to be diagnosed in a year with the
It's
person.
fine.
But it has another element to it of if they were previously diagnosed in a kidnap cholera.
I think let's leave Dana's study out. I think it's a slightly different. It doesn't necessarily nicely fit one of
Let's
these
not talk about that.
That is too complicated.
I wanted to talk about that.
But
Complicated.
So the concept is very similar to other observational studies in the sense that you're looking at proportion of people with an outcome of interest in one group versus another group, and then you do the ratio. But so you end up with here a prevalence ratio. So you're looking at the proportion of people in an exposed group who have a particular outcome divided by the prevalence in those who are not exposed, but you lose the time element, which make it, well, again, it depends on what your question is, but if it's important to know that the exposure preceded the outcome, for example, vaccination and COVID admission, it's important to know that you were vaccinated before you actually got the disease, and that you're vaccinated long enough before, because if you're vaccinated the day before you enter ITU, there's no time. So this design this is a major weakness, but again, if it's well designed, and you can try and do this. Sometimes we do cross-sectional studies. Say, for example, you want to know ITU admission and COVID infection. You can ask people, when were you vaccinated? What was the date? Of your first dose, of your second dose. But again, then you have the issue of bias, because people who were sick will probably remember better than those who were not sick, etc., etc. So it's really good, though, to as often as a first step, because you can do a single questionnaire or a single measurement, and you can generate hypotheses. But often it will need to be followed. If the timing element is important, it will need to be followed up with other types of studies. Sometimes when the exposure doesn't really, where the timing element is less important, then it could be good itself, and it could be good enough in itself. For example, if you want to know the association between gender and alcohol dependence, this is a real study. So your exposure is your gender, you male or female, and your outcome is alcohol dependency. You know that the exposure is from birth, so you don't really need to worry about that. And you just measure. You take two groups. You take a group of men, a group of women, and you measure at this particular point in time how many are alcohol dependent. And the calculation is very similar to what we saw before. So prevalence in the exposed. So if you're looking at exposed and unexposed, exposed to being male, it's just the two categories. So among males, you have, in this study, you have 5,669 males, of which 1,587 are alcohol dependent. So the prevalence of alcohol dependence is the number of people with alcohol dependence divided by the total population. And here it's 0.27. And then you do the same in the females, and you see that it's 816 divided by 8,157. And then you do the ratio. So in these observational analytical studies, you always do some kind of ratio. And you see that once you do that, you can review the math in your own time. It's not complicated math. You'll see that being male, those who were male were 2.8 times more likely to be alcohol dependent than females.
That could be a part of a paper. Like if we're doing a paper like ours, we can do what's your chances if you're Arab woman living in
Absolutely.
village, or
Yeah.
already Jews, or kibbutz.
Yeah. Most of my research, or a very high proportion of my research, is cross-sectional. If you're doing ethnic differences, for example, inequalities, most of my papers are inequalities in vaccination.
So,
Cross-sectional studies are perfect for that, because you need to look at the vaccination status, and the ethnicity doesn't change. Socioeconomic status, it's also good, but less good, because people's socioeconomic status can change over time. But things that are really fixed, gender, age, ethnicity, it's much easier, because the temporality doesn't really matter, or matters less.
If I will find, let's say, 10% of oncology cancer patients have COVID. This is a data for a cross-sectional complication. Let's say I have 500 new patients a year, and in 2020, I got 10% of them, I had them with coronavirus. This is a publication.
In itself, probably
itself.
not, because what you don't have is so here your exposure is cancer and your outcome is COVID, right? So you need an unexposed group. You need, well, this is what, if you want
a snapshot.
It depends. Because you need a research question. You need a question to answer. So what is your question? Are patients with cancer more likely to, so in that case, you could take a group of cancer patients, look at the prevalence of coronavirus in a particular year, then take a group of non-oncology patients, maybe patients from another service in the hospital, and then look at the prevalence of coronavirus, and then you look at the ratio. And if you find that oncology patients were 6 times more likely than non-oncology patients to have, then maybe you have a paper, yeah. And we know, a lot of these studies exist. Like when you look at risk factors, old people, people with multiple comorbidities.
That's what we did in the beginning, tons of cross-section
Yeah.
to identify.
Diabetes,
But you can also
respiratory
have
disease.
this population as the cancer patients and see the incidence of corona by different variables, like age, like ethnicity, like other things. Number of
Within,
cycles,
yeah.
immunity
Yes,
in the blood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but
If that's
A
your
cross-sectional
population,
study
okay,
is-
but then you need something
a
more.
cross-sectional
more
study is
variables.
analytical. Otherwise, what you said before is just descriptive epidemiology. You just say 10% of my patients, which could be interesting for different purposes, but it's not an analytical study as
You have
such.
more variables.
So
What variables?
Yeah, you can have more variables and then it's making it interesting, like their immunity, their age.
Millennium
Yeah.
variables.
So you can.
So cross-sectional studies are cheap and are quick, right? Especially if the data is already available. You can actually do them relatively rapidly, and you can look at different outcomes, many exposures at the same time, look at associations, so you can generate hypotheses in that way. However, you don't get the timing of the exposure disease very clearly. And it can be, as we said, depending on exactly what you're trying to ascertain, it can be a problem. It's not necessarily a problem. For example, we talked about difference in ethnic groups, but it can be a problem if your question requires the exposure to precede the outcome. And this is also because if you do the same study at different points in time, you may get different results. So a snapshot, think about, for example, this is an example from South Africa. If you want to know, if you want to look at diarrheal disease, whether you, or even here, if you wanted to know the prevalence of a particular disease, if you do it in different seasons, it will be different. So you have to think about what time you're doing it in, because you don't have the time element. Another issue is that because you're looking at a particular point in time, you will bias against severe cases that are likely to die quickly. For example, if you're doing a prevalence of oncology, prevalence of cancer, if there are different different stages, and like some forms are more aggressive, some forms are less aggressive, and you're looking at a particular point in time from a starting point, well, maybe those who had the more severe form, the more aggressive forms, have already died when you measure it. So you will underestimate the prevalence of the more severe forms. Whereas if you follow people through time, you will see this, right? So you have to think, and this is not relevant to all diseases, But this is why you have to think very carefully about what you're trying to measure. And when you decide on a study design, you have to think whether this particular design is suitable for your needs. And we talked about temporal precedence already. Right, so I just wanted to very briefly talk about cross-sectional studies. They're a snapshot of the association between exposure and outcome, but you have to be very careful about the fact that it's better to measure, it's good for prevalent disease, not so good for incident disease. It's not so good, you have this issue of length time bias where you're less likely to catch more severe cases. You cannot easily establish a temporal association because you're measuring both exposure and outcome at one point in time. But it uses less resources than other designs. You can test a lot of different hypotheses at the same time. And yeah, so it's a very useful study design. And depending on your question, it could be good as a starting point if you understand the limitations, or it could be an adequate design for a particular question.
So if I'm doing a research on risk-taking behavior among adolescents, so this is cross-sectional.
If you're doing a risk-taking
behavior among adolescents visiting the ER. So that's cross-sectional because
Yeah.
it's a snapshot.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
now, maybe in a year, this 15-year-old will.
Yeah.
Yours also is a cross-sectional, but
Right.
the outcomes are different.
Mine is also cross-sectional.
So it's a cross-sectional, it's